Thank you. Brilliant. Well, good morning, everybody. I like this. So my name is Sarah, and I just get the privilege this morning of, just being able to speak to you guys. We are continuing our genuine series, so I get to speak about genuine endurance. I'm going to be talking about genuine endurance through suffering. And so this really is such a meaty topic, and I think it's just really important for us just to get it right. I think we see far too many sort of casualties of suffering, too many people that have just been taken off their path because actually when things have got tough and they've met suffering, they maybe haven't had the framework to come out the other side of it still standing strong and full of faith. And I think there's two common reactions when we're going through different times. I think there's a spectrum, but I think these two things sort of sit nicely at either end of it. The first one is illustrated by this beautiful meme, which is, I'm fine, everything is fine, when literally everything is on fire. Your world is in flames, but you're like, no, I'm fine, everything's fine. I don't know if you've experienced that at all. Maybe it's your go-to reaction. Minimizing might just feel like the safest or the easiest thing for you because you don't genuinely want to acknowledge what's going on. And actually the other end of the spectrum is a bit of a pity party, and it's, you've got your face on the fridge. You know what sucks? Everything. Or the first thing that you jump to is always what's wrong. Your mind has been trained into always focusing on the negative. Attached to it, sort of a victim mentality. Your thoughts about suffering might sound a little bit like this. Bad things have happened in the past, and they will continue to happen to me. Or others are always to blame for what's happening to you and your general misfortune. And maybe there's no point in trying to make a change because it's not going to work. And I think to genuinely endure, we have to be real. We have to really take a look at what is going on and actually our true and our real thoughts about it. And maybe it's easiest to identify your natural lean in answer to a really simple question. How are you? A question that we love in the UK, and a question that we love to not have a genuine answer to. How often have you found yourself in the situation of being asked how you are, and maybe you felt like actually your world is a bit on fire, but how do you answer? Yeah, good, thanks. And you? And so I've been going through some stuff recently, maybe the last few months, just around my health. And so when someone's asked me, oh, how are you? Everything British in me wants to say, good, thanks, how are you? But never before has that answer just felt like such a lie. So in my Britishness, I downgraded my answer to, yeah, I'm okay. How are you? And then if someone delved a little bit, then I'd let them know a little bit about what was going on. So I'm not suggesting that if you're struggling in life a little bit and the lovely lady packing your bags at the Asda checkout asks you how you're doing, I'm not saying actually why don't you pour out the deepest and darkest details of what's going on with you at the moment. But I do think that it's important to let some trusted people in and actually bring them along for the ride. And I love how Jesus does this. When he just knew the extreme suffering that he was about to face, he knew the gravity of what was coming, and he knew that he was going to endure unimaginable suffering, torture, ridicule, and mockery. And this just propelled him to spend time with the Father. He knew what he needed was the presence of God, but he also took his friends along with him. He needed the presence of God, and he needed the support of those that he considered closest to him. I want us just to take a look at this from Matthew 26. It says, then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." He took his friends with him. I mean, they weren't great, they fell asleep, but he wanted to share with them how he was doing. He told them that he was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And at that point, he wanted two things. He wanted to be close to his Father and to be close to his friends. It's so helpful for us in times of suffering. What do we need? We need the presence of God and the support of people close to us. And do you know what? They're not always great. They might not know what to say. They might fall asleep. But actually, there's something that is just so important about connection and community that can just help carry us through. And it's a normal human reaction to want to withdraw from pain. I did this the other day, I touched a hot tray that had come out of the oven, and once I touched it, I very quickly whipped my hand away. If something's painful, you don't want to hold on to it. You don't want to stay where that is. And we don't like suffering. We don't see a tough path and think, oh yeah, I'd much rather go this way than this easy breezy way down the road. We are wired to avoid pain. And many of you will know that I work with homeless men and women, a lot of whom struggle with drug and alcohol dependence. And time again, listening to their stories, I hear the same thing. I just needed something to numb the pain. And I think particularly of one resident I was working with he'd actually never used heroin until he was 40 years old. But it was at this point in his life that actually his son had been really struggling with his mental health. And he'd actually ended up taking his life. And then the resident that I was working with, he just said that actually he kind of described the pain of that loss and the grief that he was experiencing, and the guilt that he was feeling for maybe feeling like he hadn't done enough, that he hadn't been there enough for his son. His whole world had just felt like it had been torn apart. So he actually ended up approaching some guys that he knew sort of had connections with drugs, and he said that he just needed something that would stop him feeling the way that he did. And he actually described it as the most magical, I'm not promoting heroin use, but no, he described it as just the most magical experience, that his pain melted away. But then he went on to describe actually the pain of family breakdown because of this grief, and then because of his addiction, that this thing gripped him so quickly, and that actually it couldn't soothe that pain. It couldn't numb that pain long term. And 20 years later, he is still caught up in just heartbreaking addiction and extreme suffering, because actually what he was looking for was a quick fix, something just to make him feel better. And I think the thing with suffering, there isn't a quick fix. It's something that we have to walk through and process and contend with, really. And now you might not have such an obvious thing that you turn to for comfort, but we all turn to something. Maybe it's an extra glass of wine or an extra few glasses of wine take the edge off a bit of a hard week, or maybe it's escaping in another way. Maybe you jump into fantasy, or you'll binge watch a series, or just stuff your face with some chocolate. And it might feel very low level, but it's all something to distract you, all something that will make you feel good in a moment. And when we start to face big struggles, if we haven't trained ourselves to first find comfort in the presence of God for the small things and the little bumps in the road, we're not going to do it for the big things. We can't just numb it. We can't just pretend it isn't there. It can't be I'm fine, everything's fine, when in reality you feel like your world is on fire. And I'm going to tell you a bit of a gross story, but thankfully I'm not going to show you the pictures, so happy days. But when I was about 10 years old, my appendix burst, and I quite quickly became just very ill. I was admitted to hospital. They kind of figured out what was going on and operated. Fantastic. But unfortunately, because my appendix had burst, there was like gunk everywhere. So basically, surgeons did the best job they could at scooping that out and just trying to get rid of all the ick. And then they ended up stapling my wound closed. And they said to the nurses, look, there's a real chance when these staples come out that the wound will open up. And that's what happened. Thankfully, my intestines didn't pop out, so that's great news. But the wound did open up because the tissue was just so infected that it couldn't heal healthily. So we started a slow and really painful process of healing this wound slowly and healthily from the bottom. And there were times where I remember saying to the doctor, I was like, can't you just sew it back up? And actually, temporarily, it might have looked quite nice, quite neat, but it would have locked infection inside, and actually I would have stayed very ill. So we started this process of just trying to heal it from the bottom. It was horrible. I do not remember it fondly. And there was just a process of the nurses would pack the wound with like ribbon bandages, which were really long, which my dad thought was great as they were pulling it out, like a magic trick, but a bit more painful. But it was such a horrible process because it had to heal healthily from the bottom, but the sides would try and heal. So they'd sort of heal a little bit to this ribbon bandage until that was ripped out multiple times a day. It was a painful process, and I did not enjoy it. And in order to go through that every day, multiple times, I had to know where we were heading, what the end result was going to be. I had to know that this painful process would lead to a healthy healing of this wound. And for us, our journey of enduring suffering can be a little bit like this. When we hit difficult times and trials, it's so important that we fully express what's going on, that we get out all the icky bits of pain and disappointment, so that actually we can walk through times of suffering with a genuine and a real endurance. And actually that we come through it not broken and still wounded, but actually healed and whole. And it can be a painful process, but I believe that it is vital in order to process healthily and come through strong. It's one thing that I love about David in the Psalms is that he pours out everything that he is feeling and experiencing. He lays it all out there. But what he doesn't do is he doesn't stay there. And you just see the change starting to happen in the Psalms. And it just basically, his perspective begins to change. He starts to lift his eyes to the reality of who God is, to the reality of his promises and his protection of David. And I believe he was able to endure times of rejection and suffering because what had gone before, because of his own kind of personal history with God. David had spent hours in the field tending his father's flock. And it was when no one else was around that David was just pouring out his heart in worship and prayer. There was no one to see him. There was no one to impress. But his pursuit of God was for no other reason than connection. And this was rare in David's time. At that point, worship was focused around the sacrifice of animals and the pouring out of their blood for the sort of temporary dealing with sin, whereas David was pouring out his heart, leading him to be known as the man after God's own heart. Now, he faced times of difficulty and rejection when King Saul became jealous of David. He had to flee in order to avoid being killed. And over the coming years, he gathered men, but they really weren't the cream of the crop. They were all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. Really, they were a bunch of rejects. But David gathered them up, and under his skillful leadership, they became his strong and mighty men. And there was one time that David had left this place called Ziklag, which I think is quite a funky name. And it was a place that had been given to him for a home for him and his men. And actually, they'd marched to go into battle, but they'd been sent back by the Philistine commanders because they weren't trusted, and it was thought that actually they would turn on them to impress King Saul and actually get back into his good books. So they had a long journey home, rejected and humiliated, only to find Ziklag had been raided by the Amalekites. They had burned it to the ground. Everything was destroyed, and their wives and sons and daughters had been taken. And this verse just gives a snapshot of the pain that they were experiencing. It says, "So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep." Now, there's two reactions to their suffering. There's the reaction of David's men and the reaction of David. David's men were grieving and hurting, and they spoke of stoning David. They wanted to punish him because of their loss. They wanted something to happen that would make them feel better. Somebody had to pay. But what was David's reaction? There's just a small but a really powerful sentence that says, "But David found strength in the Lord his God." And I believe that it was his deep history with God that started with worshipping in the fields with his sheep. He knew God's faithfulness in attacks from lions and bears. He then knew God's anointing, favor, and protection through many battles. He knew that the source of his strength was God. And the first thing he did was to get into the presence of God and ask what to do next. He sought God for the way ahead, and actually, in the end, everything was restored to him. It says this just in a few verses later. David recovered everything that the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. And I think there's just something that's so beautiful about God's heart to restore. And there's been a verse that has been on my heart for the last little while. It's from Joel 2, and it says, "I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten. You shall eat in plenty and be satisfied, and praise the name of the Lord your God, who has dealt wondrously with you." And earlier in the chapter, it's a picture of devastation and destruction. And this verse, this beautiful promise, punctuates it with the assurance of restoration, that God will rebuild and restore what was taken. And I feel like this morning there's some of us here that have been or are going through a season that has felt barren, that has felt dry, and it feels like a season that you really have had to endure. And I want you to know this morning that our God comes to restore. Like, it's just such a beautiful thing, actually, that I just love this verse. It's definitely one that's on my heart. But actually, the years that the locusts have eaten, God will come and restore. And I just think that's such a powerful thing. And actually, when I was grieving the loss of some people that I just really loved from my life, I was slow to press in to the presence of God. I felt just sort of stuck, just in, sorry, just in the pain that I had experienced. And I think that part of it was that I didn't kind of healthily process my initial loss when a friend of mine had passed away. And then when when I then experienced sort of future and kind of further losses, it just compounded it. Thank you. And I was just actually not in a great place, and I was still chugging along with Jesus, but I don't think that I would have described my life as a joy-filled, abundant life. And I think of some of you that walked me through that season would attest to that, and thank you for bearing with me and actually being that community that brings people on, that challenges, that prompts. It's so important. But what I want to tell you about that season is actually what God did what God did in the midst of it. I'd actually been having some grief counselling that had been a helpful process, but about halfway through, I ended up going to a conference with some friends, and there was definitely like a battle going on. God wanted me free. He knew that there was so much more for me than just being stuck in my pain, but there was a fight for that freedom. And I suddenly started to feel really like physically sick. So actually during one of the breaks, I did cheekily go out to the car park and I threw up. So it was okay, it was in the trees, it's like woods. So then I actually was like, I'm going to lie down in the car for a little bit of this break. I had a little blanket, had a little lie down. But I felt so strongly in my spirit I needed to be in the next meeting, and I thought, actually, I don't think this is like a normal sort of physical illness, like a bug. I felt like it was actually a battle. It was something to keep me where I was, and so I took my little blanket and went and just sat at the back of this meeting, just on the floor, and I just had this feeling that God was going to do something. And actually, I felt like there was going to be a word of knowledge that I would respond to. And sure enough, the guy that was speaking just shared a word of knowledge that spoke about 3 specific losses that I had gone through. And I was like, that's me. Like, this is it. This is the moment. And so I left my little blanket and I just walked to the front and responded and went to get prayer. And I knew that this was going to be just that significant moment. And as I got prayed for, all this pain and disappointment and grief just poured out, and I ugly cried. I'm talking like there was snot, and it was just like the depths of all this pain that I think I just tried to kind of squash down and just sort of carry on. It all came out, and I tell you something, it was ugly crying, but it felt so good. It felt such a release, and just literally think I cried harder than I have ever cried in my life. And what was transformational for me in that moment was actually in the spirit, in the presence of God. I just started to laugh. And just as my crying had been ugly crying, this was like belly laughing. And it made me realize, actually, it felt a little bit strange to begin with. And I realized how long it had been that I hadn't laughed for. That actually I'd just been carrying around this stuff that just acted as a block to joy. It acted as a blocker for actually the things that God has for me. He wants us to live a joy-filled, abundant life. And so often there's things that get in the way. There's things that we just carry around with us. But actually, we've got to lay them down. We've got to get them out. We've got to get all of that ick out. But it was, honestly, I can tell you, it was good for my soul. And as I kind of got up off the floor, after that encounter with God, I was transformed. There was something supernatural that happened in that moment. In the moment that I let go of just that hurt and that pain, God rushed in. And in his kindness, he just set me free from just all that junk that I had been carrying around. It's so true in Psalm 30 where it says, weeping may stay for the night, but joy comes in the morning. And later it talks about you turn my wailing into dancing. And I'd never experienced something so sort of night and day as that. I get the process, I get the whatever, but this was an immediate, this was a God breaking in and breaking through. I was literally transformed in a moment. And I think God had actually been so kind to me on the journey, and actually in the process, he got me to a point where I was able to start to look at some of the stuff that I've been carrying. But it was that immediate breakthrough in his presence that brought transformation. There was still stuff to process. There was still a kind of a journey to go on. But I can tell you, everything changed that day. And that's really what I'm trusting God for in this season. I know that he has done it in my life. I know that he can do it in yours. And I'm so passionate about just seeing people set free from the stuff that we're carrying that we just don't need to be. And if I'm honest, that's how we genuinely endure suffering. We can't limp through it. We've got to run into the presence of God. That's where we can unload our pain and be met with his steadfast goodness and kindness. It means that when we go on to endure kind of future trials and suffering, because we know the goodness of God and we haven't let bitterness and resentment build up and just take us out of the plans and promises that he had for us. I love where Jesus references Isaiah because the passage that he links back to is just so rich, and it speaks just of the restoration that he brings. I just want to read this to you. It says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me." It's good. He's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. They will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. God is all about a process of restoration. When we go to him in our brokenness, he makes an incredible exchange. It's joy instead of mourning and praise instead of despair. So how do we endure suffering? How do we stand strong? We run into the presence of God. It's so easy to blame or deflect, but our suffering has to propel us into the presence of God. Anywhere else, and our comfort is misplaced. It's so easy to look to other things to soothe our soul in just times of despair. But but the only real and genuine comfort will come from the presence of God. There's a guy Bill Johnson, who he leads a church in America, and just recently said this beautiful nugget. He, not long ago, lost his wife after a battle with cancer, and he said, this, we don't need understanding to feel at peace. We need presence. We are going to face things that we don't understand and that we can't fully comprehend. But when in those moments we press into the presence of God, the peace that surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And would I want to go through my times of challenge again? Absolutely not. But I'm just so thankful for what God has done in my heart in the midst of pain and suffering. And it means that actually when I do face trials and difficulties, and when I stand alongside friends who are struggling, I know who my God is. I know, that actually He is a God of restoration and promise. And I know that when we encounter Him in His presence, everything changes. We've got an amazing promise of a glorious eternity where every tear will be wiped away. There will be no more pain, no more suffering. It's a wonderful and a glorious reality. But I don't believe that is it, that we endure suffering only with the hope of these things being made right in eternity. He's not simply victorious at the end of the story, but He is Emmanuel, God with us in every moment. And do you know what? Sometimes some of our biggest battles are won in the midst of suffering. When we stand firm, when we don't understand, when we can't comprehend where God is or the plan that He has in that situation. When we trust without understanding, we tap into something of that peace that surpasses all understanding. In eternity, there's no more pain, there's no more suffering. But when we are walking through trials and difficulties, in these moments that actually we can offer a costly sacrifice of praise, that we can worship in the midst of pain. And so often is worship that brings breakthrough. When we stop just going through the motions and we give God real, raw, and authentic worship. He knows what it is to suffer, what it is to be rejected and endure extreme pain. He has walked through trial and difficulty. There is no one else that can understand our times of turmoil and pain like Jesus. He knows us better than our husbands, our wives, than our closest friend. Who better to walk us through our times of suffering? We can endure all things because of the strength that we find in Jesus. And I just want to finish just with this little verse from Isaiah 41. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and I will help you. For I am the Lord your God who takes hold of your right hand and says to you, do not fear, I will help you.
Thank you. It'll just be really good, just really feel God is on this word. And if any of you can resonate with what Sarah has shared, it would just be really good to have, while tea and coffee's going on, to come to the front, and there will be people here to pray for you. I particularly felt as Sarah was speaking, 2 groups of people, that there are some people here who have been numbing their pain, who have been trying to numb their pain with different things. It might be with drugs, with alcohol, with pornography, with different things. If you've been trying to numb your pain, and you want that to stop, you want to actually start dealing with it, then we'd ask you to come forward. And also, for those of you that just feel like you've locked your pain inside, you've stitched it up, you don't want to do, it just feels infected, just feel that the healer, God, wants to come and just tenderly unpick those stitches and deal with the infection and to get it out. Also, if there's any of you here that need healing, need a fresh touch from Jesus and need healing, would encourage you to come forward. So thank you for that, Sarah. That was powerful. It was amazing. Thank you. So we release you into teas and coffees. Bless you.